The village of Black Hollow had always been shrouded in mystery. Nestled deep within the dense, ancient forests, it was a place where the sun seemed to hesitate, casting long, eerie shadows even at noon. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the woods, warning travelers to stay away after dark. But no one ever explained why. Not until he arrived. It began with a whisper. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. At first, the villagers dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on their ears. But soon the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of hunger, of longing, of an ancient thirst that could never be quenched. Then the disappearances started. One by one, villagers vanished without a trace. No blood, no struggle, no sign of a fight. Just empty beds and cold hearts. Panic spread like wildfire, and the once bustling streets of Black Hollow became deserted by nightfall. Those who dared to venture out after dark spoke of a tall, gaunt figure lurking at the edge of the forest, his eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. His name was never spoken aloud, but the villagers knew him as the Shadow Drinker. A vampire, they said, cursed to walk the earth for eternity, feeding on the lifeblood of the living. Some claimed he was once a nobleman who had made a pact with the devil, while others believed he was a vengeful spirit, bound to the forest by some unspeakable sin. One moonless night, a young woman named Eliza decided she could no longer live in fear. Armed with nothing but a lantern and her father's old hunting knife, she ventured into the forest, determined to uncover the truth. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they seemed to come from all directions at once. And then she saw him. He stood at the edge of a clearing, his pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Eliza felt as though her very soul was being drained from her body. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The vampire smiled, revealing a row of razor-sharp fangs. "You should not have come," he said, his voice a low, melodic whisper that sent shivers down her spine. Eliza's grip tightened on the knife, but before she could move, the vampire was upon her. His cold fingers wrapped around her throat, and she felt the sharp sting of his fangs against her skin. But just as he was about to strike, a distant sound broke the silence. A church bell ringing out from the village. The vampire hissed, releasing her and retreating into the shadows. "This is not over," he whispered, his voice fading into the night. "I will find you again." Eliza stumbled back to the village, her body trembling and her mind racing. She had survived, but for how long? The Shadow Drinker was still out there, waiting, watching. And the whispers, they never truly stopped. Eliza's return to the village was met with silence. The few villagers who dared to peek out from behind their curtains quickly shut them as she passed. She could feel their fear, their suspicion. They knew she had gone into the forest, and now she had returned, alive. To them, that was more terrifying than the disappearances. The whispers followed her home. They slithered through the cracks in the walls, crept under the door, and echoed in the hollows of her mind. "He is coming. He is coming." The voice was faint, but it was there, a constant reminder of the horror she had faced. Eliza spent the next few days in a haze, jumping at every shadow, every creak of the floorboards. She tried to convince herself that the vampire was gone, that he had moved on to some other cursed village. But deep down she knew better. The Shadow Drinker had marked her, and he would return. One night, as the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, Eliza heard a knock at her door. Her heart raced as she approached, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. She opened the door to find an old woman standing on her doorstep, her face hidden beneath a tattered hood. "You've seen him, haven't you?" the woman croaked, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. Eliza nodded, too afraid to speak. The old woman stepped inside without invitation, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for something. "He is ancient," she said, "older than the forest, older than the village. He cannot be killed, not by mortal hands." "Then what can I do?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. The old woman reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside was a vial of dark, viscous liquid and a piece of parchment covered in strange symbols. "This is his blood," the woman said, holding up the vial. And this, she pointed to the parchment, is a binding spell. If you can trap him in a circle of his own blood, you can bind him to this world, preventing him from feeding. But be warned, the spell requires a sacrifice. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. What kind of sacrifice? The old woman's eyes darkened. A life for a life. To bind him, you must offer your own. Eliza stared at the vial, her mind racing. She had no desire to die, but the thought of the vampire continuing to prey on the village was unbearable. Is there no other way? The old woman shook her head. The shadow drinker is a creature of darkness. Only light can banish him, and light demands a price. Before Eliza could respond, the old woman placed the box in her hands and turned to leave. The choice is yours, she said, her voice fading as she disappeared into the night. The final night. Eliza waited until the next new moon, when the darkness was at its thickest. She poured the vampire's blood in a circle around her cottage, the symbols from the parchment etched into the ground with a piece of chalk. Her hands shook as she worked, but she forced herself to stay focused. This was her only chance. As the clock struck midnight, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. Eliza stood in the center of the circle, her knife in one hand and the parchment in the other. "I know you're here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Show yourself." The vampire materialized out of the darkness, his eyes glowing like twin flames. "You cannot escape me," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You are mine." Eliza held up the parchment and began to recite the spell. The symbols on the ground glowed with an eerie light, and the circle of blood began to shimmer. The vampire hissed, his form flickering as if he were being pulled in two directions at once. "What have you done?" he snarled, his voice filled with rage. "I've bound you," Eliza said, her voice growing weaker as the spell took its toll. "You'll never feed again." The vampire lunged at her, but the circle held him back, the light from the symbols burning his skin. He let out a blood-curdling scream, his form dissolving into smoke as the spell reached its climax. Eliza fell to her knees, her strength fading. She could feel the life draining from her body, but she smiled as she watched the vampire's form disintegrate. The whispers stopped and the forest fell silent. Epilogue. The villagers found Eliza's body the next morning, lying in the center of the blood circle. Her face was peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. The cottage was empty, the shadows gone. For a time, the disappearances stopped, and the villagers began to hope that the nightmare was over. But deep in the forest, where the trees grew thick and the sunlight never reached, a faint whisper could still be heard. "I am coming." The village of Black Hollow returned to a fragile semblance of normalcy. The disappearances ceased and the whispers faded into memory. Eliza's sacrifice was spoken of in hushed tones, a bittersweet legend of bravery and selflessness. But legends, like shadows, have a way of lingering. Years passed and the forest grew thicker, darker. The villagers avoided it entirely, even in daylight. Children were warned never to stray too close to the tree line, and travelers were told to take the long road around Black Hollow. Yet, despite their precautions, strange occurrences began to plague the village once more. Livestock were found drained of blood, their bodies cold and lifeless. Strange markings appeared on doors and windows, symbols that no one could decipher. And at night, the whispers returned, soft at first but growing louder with each passing day. The return. One stormy night, a traveler arrived in the village, seeking shelter from the rain. He was a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes and a voice that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. He called himself Alaric, and he claimed to be a scholar of the occult. The villagers were wary, but the innkeeper, a man named Thomas, offered him a room. As Alaric settled in, he began to ask questions about the village's history, particularly about the legend of Eliza and the Shadow Drinker. "You've heard the story, then?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Alaric nodded, his expression unreadable. "I have. And I believe the curse is not yet broken." Thomas paled. "What do you mean?" Alaric leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. The vampire was bound, not destroyed, and binding spells, they weaken over time, especially when the sacrifice is incomplete. Thomas frowned. Incomplete? Eliza gave her life. Did she? Alaric's eyes gleamed with a strange light. Or did she merely delay the inevitable? The truth unveiled. Alaric spent the next few days poring over old records and speaking with the village elders. He learned of the old woman who had given Eliza the binding spell, a figure who had vanished without a trace. He also discovered that Eliza's body had been buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the forest, a place no one dared to visit. One night, Alaric ventured to the grave, carrying a lantern and a strange ancient tome. He knelt beside the crumbling headstone and began to chant, his voice echoing through the trees. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Suddenly the earth split open and a pale hand emerged, clawing its way to the surface. Eliza's body rose from the grave, her eyes hollow and her skin as white as snow. She was no longer the brave young woman who had sacrificed herself. She was something else entirely. "You called me back," she said, her voice a hollow echo. Alaric smiled. "I did. And now you will help me finish what you started." The final confrontation. Eliza led Alaric deep into the forest, to the place where she had confronted the Shadow Drinker all those years ago. The circle of blood was still there, faint but visible, the symbols etched into the ground glowing faintly in the moonlight. Alaric began to chant again, his voice rising in pitch and intensity. The ground shook, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around them like a living entity. From the darkness, the Shadow Drinker emerged, his form flickering and unstable. "You dare summon me?" the vampire hissed, his eyes blazing with fury. "I do," Alaric said, his voice steady. "And now you will serve me." The vampire laughed, a sound that sent chills through the forest. "Foolish mortal. You cannot control me." "Perhaps not alone," Alaric said, turning to Eliza. "But with her I can." Eliza stepped forward, her hollow eyes fixed on the vampire. "You took everything from me," she said, her voice filled with a cold, unyielding rage. "Now I will take everything from you." The two beings clashed, their forms blurring as they fought. Alaric continued to chant, the symbols on the ground glowing brighter and brighter until the entire forest was bathed in light. The vampire screamed, his form dissolving into ash, but not before delivering a final, devastating blow. The end, or a new beginning? When the light faded, Alaric lay on the ground, his body broken and lifeless. Eliza stood over him, her form flickering between human and something far more sinister. The binding spell had been broken, but at a terrible cost. The villagers found Alaric's body the next morning, along with the remnants of the circle. Eliza was nowhere to be found, but the whispers in the forest grew louder, more insistent. Some claimed to see her wandering the woods at night, a ghostly figure with hollow eyes and a thirst for vengeance. The Shadow Drinker was gone, but the curse of Black Hollow lived on. And as long as the forest stood, the whispers would never truly fade.